It's a pleasure to join you this afternoon. I'm Spero Manson. I'm Little Shell Chippewa from the Turtle Mountain Reservation in North Dakota, and I direct the Centers for American and Alaska Native Health there at the CU Anschutz Medical Campus. And this was an interesting task that Matt had asked of me, and you'll see perhaps in a few moments why it was interesting. First off, a little bit of personal background about me. Although I have this Greek-derived name, Spero Manson, my paternal grandfather, his name was Spero Manasis. He emigrated along with a brother and three cousins from an idyllic island of Zonkatos off the Aegean coast of Greece. And arriving at Ellis Island in 1906, the five of them were immediately hired by the Great Northern Railroad, relocated up to central North Dakota, just 3 miles south of the U.S.-Canadian border, where they all met and married Ojibwe, full-blooded Chippewa women. And that's the genesis for these large Greek Chippewa families all throughout eastern Montana, northern North Dakota, and western Minnesota that few people realize. And of course, much of our history in the United States is related to migration and the interaction of immigrants to the United States and Native people. I'm also, in addition to being a quarter Chippewa and a quarter Greek, I'm a quarter Irish and a quarter German. And it's the last that probably is most relevant of the two of the four roots of my background. I've also been married for 32 years to a woman who is German, albeit both a US and German citizen, and she's an internist. And so I have firsthand an understanding of the German interest and romance with American Indians, and you'll see in a bit that relationship. So let me move, let's see. Let me move through a series of, I think, central concepts and experiences, first on the American Indian side, particularly within the confines of North America. And then I'll move to the parallels in Nazi Germany, but particularly Germany initially, and then the Nazi regime specifically. So it's really important to understand the movement to dehumanize American Indians, the othering of Native people. And it begins, of course, with the missionary movements and the colonization of the Americas. Best illustrated here in the 1525 quote by the Dominican Tomas Ortiz, who wrote of Native people that they are incapable of learning, they exercise none of the humane arts or industries, and by age 10 or 12, they seem to have some civilization, but later they become like real brute beasts, more stupid than asses, and refuse to improve in anything. And although it's fairly bald-faced, one finds throughout the writings of many of the representatives of the denominational religions as they ventured to the New World for 200 to 300 years, this notion that somehow American Indians and the Native people of these continents were subhuman at best. And so we see throughout the literature labeling of Native people as less than human, heathen, neophytes, soulless, wild, uncivilized, or pagan. And I take these quotes directly from the literature themselves that survived to the day. And these attributions were frequently made by the individuals who were charged with converting religiously and educating American and Alaska Native people. And it really solidified the racial construct of American Indian. And it was, in fact, this resulting dehumanization of Native peoples that was grounded in this archetype of humanity, defined essentially as white and Christian. And it gave license and justification to the extreme violence and brutality that was exercised against the indigenous peoples of both the North American subcontinents. We fast forward to the early 1800s and the establishment of the United States as a sovereign nation, and ultimately its rapid expansion east to west. And I'm sure you may be familiar with the notion of manifest destiny that became crystallized in the 1830s and really characterized the United States' domestic policies and westward expansion throughout those 3 to 4 decades. And it was really pursued as a policy of expansion based on manifest destiny, that is the ideology that it is the basic right and fact and destiny of Americans to extend this sovereign nation across the entire continent, spanning east and west coasts. And it was at this time the US government began to encounter resistance from American Indian tribal nations to that expansion, and began to use treaties as the basic mechanism by which to interact with those tribal nations and ultimately arrive at a series of policies by which they could displace Native peoples from their tribal lands. And this was all embodied in the Removal Act of the 1830s. And in cases where this effort failed as a matter of policy, the government was quick to violate the treaties and the Supreme Court rulings that actually supported the tribal nation's position and rights in this regard. We moved then, during this period of removal, to a very explicit policy of extermination, seeing Native people as threats to progress. And on the left-hand side here, you can actually see waybills and payment vouchers for the scalping of American Indians who stood in the way of this expansionist movement. And indeed, Thomas Jefferson, Henry Clay, and others in their writings crystallized this notion that American Indian people stood in the way of American expansion and that we were impossible to civilize and we were ultimately destined for extinction. And indeed, in 1863, one of the penultimate examples of this attempt to exterminate Native people was in the form of bounties that the state of Minnesota provided to volunteer scouts to rid the state of the Dakota people. We move forward in time then to the Indian Appropriations Act of 1851. And as white settlers continued to press westward and needed more and more land, Indian territory shrank despite the provisions of these prior treaties. And ultimately to the point where there's no more land for the US government to requisition to relocate American Indian nations. So in 1851, Congress passed the Indian Appropriations Act, which has created the Indian reservation system and provided funds to relocate tribal nations onto those reservations and hopefully keep them under control. It was in fact, during this period in time, it was the peak of the Indian Wars, quote unquote. And this act effectively made American Indians wards of the US government and paved the way for a host of other laws that provided the federal government increasing authority and power over the land and lives of indigenous peoples. Back continuing forward in time, the Dawes Act of 1887 provided another mechanism by which to continue to usurp the ownership and rights to the land that had been previously ceded to American Indian nations. Now, American Indians were being moved wholesale onto the reservations, but still had title through a series of other mechanisms to lands outside of those reservations. And the Dawes Act of 1887 was designed to, in fact, provide a means of incursion into and the usurpation of those lands. And you can see here that on the upper right, the Indian land for sale, widely advertised, that led to land rushes, pictured here. And then ultimately the cartoon in the lower right indicates how the US government had now parceled out, literally in terms of 640 acre sections that it was assigning to Indian people in exchange for their rights to broader ownership of such landscape. It was then that the phrase "the Indian problem" came to the fore and used more fully, and became a way of talking about how to either fully assimilate or eliminate American Indians from the landscape, and to further the progress of expansionism envisioned by the federal government. And at this point in time, we also saw the emergence of boarding schools, which were at a long distance from the homelands of most American Indian tribal nations and people. You may have seen the series Yellowstone with Kevin Costner and others, depicting in the various episodes the brutality and the forced attendance and the literally kidnapping of Indian children as young as 5 and 6 years of age through high school and relocating them in these boarding schools far distance from their home communities. These boarding schools only began to be recognized as these vehicles for assimilation in the early 60s and 70s. So they have had a long history. And in fact, Brigadier General Richard Pratt, who founded and was a longtime superintendent of the influential Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, coined the phrase, purpose of these boarding schools was to kill the Indian and thereby save the man. And this entire movement of assimilation, which boarding schools was the premier example, was one of the major activities of Friends of the Indian movement at the end of the 19th century. And it was all part of, seen as a way of leading to the civilization of these once noble American Indians. On the bottom left, you can see the classes in attendance at the Carlisle Indian School. You can see here in the middle photo, the young boys being taught to pray. And on the right, the photos of one of the attendees before and after graduation from Carlisle Indian School. And of course, simultaneous with this was the rise of eugenics, and it was seen as a means for eliminating the less desirable. And although we think of eugenics, and you'll see in a moment in the context of Nazi Germany, it had its roots here in America in the context of American Indian people and also other racial and ethnic disadvantaged populations. Few people realize the nature and extent to which these eugenic movements impacted the lives of American Indian people. But to give you a sense, that between 1930 and 1965, a conservative estimate was that 25% of all American Indian women of childbearing age were sterilized, knowingly or unwittingly, unknowingly or unwittingly. And it's been labeled as a major form of genocide, not just for American Indian people, but for the other racial and ethnic minority populations in the United States who were subject to the same kinds of atrocities. So with that background, now let's shift to the context of Germany and its romanticism of American Indians. The German people have long been interested in American Indians and the US's relationship with tribal nations. And this interest stems from a perceived connection or romanticized similarity between American Indian tribal peoples and the Germanic tribes of the ancient times. Indeed, you can look back to the 1st century in the Christian era to Senator Tacitus, who wrote Germania during that period of time, where he portrayed Germans as a noble tribal people of formidable, violent warriors with painted faces and an existential connection to the forests and lands of Europe. Sound familiar? Yes, indeed, the ways in which American Indians in the United States were originally painted. So Germany then had a long history of discovering firsthand American Indian people and acquiring an ever-increasing appreciation and affection for us. It really, you can see it in the travels of Alexander von Humboldt, a cartographer and explorer of much heralded fame throughout the 19th century, in which he inspired the German literate classes to take this new world and its indigenous people seriously. And of course, if you're at all a student of Western art, you know of Karl Bodmer's work, a painter, German painter who captured American Indians in the American West in very vivid and realistic fashions during the 19th century, as he accompanied the German explorer Prince Maximilian And this was from 1832 to 1834 during his Missouri River expedition. Then, of course, Karl May. Karl May has a very particular place in German literature and the increased romanticism of Germans with American Indians. He was a best-selling novelist. He sold over 100 million copies of 8 different volumes that featured Chief Winnetou, an amalgam of a Northern Plains Apache chief and Old Shatterhand, who himself was a German immigrant who was the Lone Ranger equivalent of Tonto to Chief Winnetou. And he described in this world of Indians and cowboys, but he did it in a highly fictionalized, romanticized way because he'd never seen, met, or experienced American Indian people in situ. And then lastly, Rudolf Kronau. He was a correspondent and artist for the German illustrated magazine Die Gartenlaube. He had an extended stay on Standing Rock Reservation in the Dakota Territories, where he met Sitting Bull and other native leaders, and his travels then also took him to Yellowstone, Albuquerque, and Santa Fe. And of particular note here, he was a contemporary of Hitler and many of Hitler's associates, and was a major advocate for understanding American Indian lived experience and the policies of the United States towards Native people, and promoted the greater familiarity of that, and suggested that there were many important lessons to be learned for the Nazi policies that subsequently followed. Speaking of the Nazi policies that subsequently followed, they basically took pages from the same book that the United States had written in regard to American Indian people. Hitler is himself familiar with the official U.S. Indian policies used to acquire much of its territorial empire, including removal, reservation, and the assimilation areas of Indian policies, those of which I briefly enumerated previously. And these policies were all designed to acquire Indian lands for the United States and to remove, concentrate, and exterminate Indians. And we begin to see now a very clear parallel in terms of the Nazi policies towards their perceived counterparts in Europe and Eastern Europe. And indeed, Hitler envisioned the German East of Poland, Ukraine, and Russia as analogous to the American frontier of the West. He expected to expand the German empire eastwards in the same fashion the United States had westward. So the manifest destiny notion became translated into the Nazi quest for Lebensraum, or living space, in Eastern Europe. And Hitler and other Nazi leaders often referred to Jews, Poles, and Ukrainians as Indians. And when I'm using these quotes around these phrases, I've extracted them literally from the writings. So from Hitler and his associates' points of view, the indigenous Slavs in Poland and Russia were basically savages of a different color. They had all the same qualities of quote-unquote wild people who lived in the wilderness. They were described and seen as savages, nomads, passive and childlike. And indeed, the National Socialist Party assumed the mantle of noble colonizers who were fighting against ignoble savages, echoes of the discourse in the United States in regard to American Indians in the Manifest Destiny in the mid-1800s. Indeed, Hitler declared, quote, that the East Slavic inhabitants were to be regarded and treated as, quote, American Redskins, end quote. Hans Frank, the Nazi general governor of Poland, called Jews in Poland flat-footed Indians. Lebensraum, as manifest destiny, is really important to understand. As Hitler prepared for war with the East, he drew in writing as well as in his rhetoric direct parallels between the Nazi quest for Lebensraum and manifest destiny and the treatment of American Indians. In October of 1941, he explained his vision of the German East to be populated by ex-soldiers who would be settled on millions of acres of homesteads. He characterized and remarked, the Volga must be our Mississippi. Again, direct reference to the American Indian circumstances and U.S. policies toward Native people. Some German politicians of the day even argued in favor of creating American-style Indian reservations to control and assimilate colonized peoples. In 1909, German colonial newspapers drew parallels between the genocidal acts in German Southwest Africa and measures the United States had taken against Indians on its frontier. And in 1941, Hitler stated plainly, there's only one task: to set about the Germanization of the land by bringing Germans and to regard the indigenous inhabitants as Indians. So there's this general ethos of conquest, expansion, and racial ideologies that we see direct parallels to in the American circumstance. And you can see here on the far left, pictured graphically, the yellow stars characterizing American Indians, and in fact, the forms that they began to develop to certify racial status. This has its direct counterparts among American Indians. I, for example, as a enrolled member of a federally recognized tribe, the Little Shell Chippewa, have a certificate degree of Indian blood, a CDIB, that actually attests to my blood quantum as a member of my nation. And so too, here we have a similar parallel in terms of the certification and documentation of the racial status of Jewish people. In 41, again, Hitler equated the German invasion of Russia with the Indian Wars in North America and called it a real Indian War. And it was long before the Wannsee Conference in 41 that there had been the decision to exterminate all European Jewish peoples. There were discussions of removing German Jews and including proposals over decades to remove all European Jews to Madagascar, again, reminiscent of this relocation, concentration, and ultimately extermination. Just as there was the eugenics movement in North America and the United States, and it had its impact on American Indian people, so too Nazi racial science carried the same message. This particular message, much like we observed in regard to the United States and its relationship to American Indians, was designed to rationalize a campaign of cleansing German society of individuals viewed as biological threats to the nation's health. And the Nazis, as I think most of us know, developed racial health policies that began with the mass sterilization of genetically diseased, that is, subordinate, inferior, subhuman individuals, and ended with the near annihilation that we all well know as of European Jewry. And with this patina of legitimacy provided by the racial science experts of the day, the Nazi regime, in addition to the many deaths in the Holocaust and the camps, actually carried out nearly 500,000 forced sterilizations and 250,000 euthanasia deaths of infants or fetuses to eliminate the racial enemies of the German state. So too, we saw that ghettos arise among Nazi Germany. And it's, as I indicated earlier, it was the relocation, concentration, and ultimately the ability to exterminate as a consequence of that recapitulated in Nazi Germany. We saw the concentration movement to limit the living space of specific peoples, whether it be Jews, the indigenous Slavs of Eastern Europe, Ukraine and Russia, that would ultimately lead towards their concentration and extermination. And we saw the same kinds of enforced policies that were used and deployed against American Indians at work here by Nazi politicians against Jews and Slavic peoples, where in America we had reservations. In Germany, we had ghettos. And ultimately, this concentration in the ghettos led to the more efficient and greater ability of the Nazi German regime to actually move those populations into the concentration camp, their ultimate extermination. So there are many, many parallels. And we actually talk about the American Indian Holocaust just as we do the Jewish Holocaust. But I want to emphasize that in the end, what's arisen is the phoenix of both. That we have today, a very proud, resilient, strength-based groups of people, both American Indian as well as Jewish, who stand knowingly on the histories of their forebears and recognize the historical movements and forces that characterize much of the histories of their people in relationship to the United States and to Germany and other totalitarian regimes of a similar ilk. And I think it's an amazing thing to recognize the resilience that is evident as you talk to representatives of each of these groups. So I'll just stop there. That's the broad context that I wanted to introduce to you as the basis for, I presume, will be a discussion, and invite your comments.